This intro is going to be short and sweet and very straightforward. Lots of folks are here for this discussion. We have Matt Yglesias of Slow Boring and Derek Thompson of The Atlantic. Have a great conversation. Join us on stage.
That's workers of the world unite, nothing to lose but your permitting obstacles. It's good. I love to speak adjacent to Ted because I come across as a non-contentious, non-trolly kind of person, and it's really lovely. So I think as Ted was expressing, I think most of the kind of ideas that are in this room, that are at this conference, if you look at them on an individual level, these are notions that have percolated for a while and are to some extent like the timeless issues of the human condition. But what Derek really did a couple years ago was he came up with a good alliterative name, Abundance Agenda, and that has really taken off. I think nobody's ever heard of eco-modernism. Nobody knows what that means. But abundance is suddenly everywhere. It's abundant itself. And I wonder how did that come to you that we needed this frame?
Well, first off, it's great to be here. Thank you all for being here. And I want to start by saying that there's a deep irony to Matt Yglesias asking me where I got the word abundance. The answer is that certainly in part I got it by reading Matt Yglesias. To a certain extent, the fact that we're even having a conversation where you're interviewing me about the concept of abundance is a little bit like, to keep a theme going, Marx asking Engel where he got his ideas about communism. This came from you. It is your fault as much as it is anyone's fault. I did the work of adding an alliterative word to the end of abundance, and I've thought a lot about why the juxtaposition of the word abundance and agenda really took off. I think part of it is the musicality of alliteration. I think part of it is the fact that there's a interesting juxtaposition between abundance, which sounds airy and dreamy, with the word agenda, which feels concrete and very in the weeds, and so maybe there was something happening there. But I also think it had to do with the moment. This was the winter, the early months of 2022, and I got the idea for the abundance agenda as I was standing in line on a frigid day in Washington, D.C., waiting for a set of rapid COVID tests. This was when Omicron was winding its way through Washington, D.C., and I remember just standing in line for the shortage of COVID tests that existed in this particular DC locale and thinking, this is somewhat embarrassing that the richest country in the world still has to have essentially bread lines for a shortage of an incredibly essential material, which is COVID tests. And as I was thinking about the overall experience of Americans in the pandemic, it was impossible to ignore the fact that scarcity had been a theme of our interaction with the federal government in the pandemic. In the early months of COVID's breaking out in the US, Fauci, I think, took his stand against masks because there weren't enough masks to go around. And then there wasn't enough PPE to go around for our doctors. And there weren't enough vaccines to go around. And so we had to come up with these really cockamamie rules for how we would order the sequencing of vaccinating people. And then finally, there weren't enough rapid tests. And as I sort of zoomed out of the situation of the pandemic, it seemed, again, unignorable to me that a story of America in the 21st century and a story of our problems in the 21st century had been a story of manufactured scarcities. We know how to build apartments in Washington, D.C., but we choose to have a height limit. We know how to build apartments in San Francisco, but we choose a set of zoning and land use regulations that make it impossible to do so. We know how to build apartments that block views of Mount Rainier in Portland, but there are rules that say, nope, you legally cannot do that. The view of Mount Rainier is much more important than having housing abundance in the city of Portland. And it just seemed to me that in the subjects of COVID and public health, in housing and in clean energy, we were doing this to ourselves. We were choosing scarcity mindsets. And because we were choosing these mindsets, we could always make the opposite choice. And it was just from that moment of extreme frustration and even anger that this concept of an abundance agenda really took root, I would say.
And I think that's interesting because, I think we talk a lot about energy, we talk a lot about housing here. Those are just huge sectors of the economy, so they are worth talking about a lot. But that origin for you was about something else, and it's part of the development of this concept as a more kind of a general framework and a turn apart from a zero-sum politics, right? I mean, I think that if you look at, what's been the predominant strains on the left, it's not just whatever you might think about environmental groups, but a really hard distributive focus ever since Piketty. And growing on the right, a kind of a zero-sum concept about international trade, about immigration, right? Versus a question of, can we just have more things, and then there's enough to go around, which is both a traditional way of looking at the world, but also, I think, quite different from like mainstream politics.
You put your finger on something that is core to the project that I'm working on right now with Ezra, and I guess I would just steal from his work in the following few minutes. I think that since the 1970s, the birth of what you lovingly and we lovingly call the neoliberal era, liberals have, progressives have, Democrats have historically looked at complicated problems by first asking themselves the question, how do we solve this problem with money? We have problems of unequal access to healthcare. We have all sorts of problems with healthcare. The question has first and foremost been asked, how do we universalize access to insurance? An incredibly important question, by the way. When we want to solve issues of poverty, we think, how do we solve this problem predominantly through the tax code? What do we do with TAMF? What do we do with the EITC? Again, that's on the redistributive side. There's been a default in the last 50 years, I think you can persuasively argue, that Democrats' position has been to look at complicated problems and to think, how do we solve this problem on the demand side? How do we solve this problem with money? And there's a ton of problems that can be solved wholly or at least in part by money, but that's not enough. Because in addition to demand, economists know there's also supply. And so one thing that the book is trying to do, one thing that I hope this movement is trying to do, is to shift that default ever so subtly, or sometimes in some cases dramatically, toward the question, how do we solve this problem with supply? Mm-hmm. And hopefully that is one of the most important things that people take away from this movement called abundance, which frankly I'm happy to have had a part in inspiring, but feel no ability to control. I mean, it's not that I wish to control it. It is democratic and it is larval and it's going to become whatever it's going to become. I have a 13-month-old right now, so I know only too intimately how something that you can give birth to can become both adorable and a monster at the same time. But I would like, if I can make one request, I would like one of the most important contributions of this movement to be to give people that default value, to ask themselves when they confront difficult problems in the world of public policy, how do I solve this problem with supply? And I think that that is a question that lots of people are asking themselves, even if they're asking themselves that question in vocabulary that doesn't quite include those words.
Interesting. So, I mean, do you think, I mean, you're working on a book. I hope, people will buy it. People are going to want to read it. Do you see that as like aspiring to catalyze like a mass movement? Or do you want, like some smart people to read the book and change how they think about technical public policy questions?
So here I'm definitely just speaking for myself. I want this to be a movement.
I mean, you do want people to buy the book.
I, of course, want people to buy the book. It'd be interesting. I want this to be a movement that also includes no book sales. It would be a very strange and very specific desire. I do want this to be a movement. I think the environmentalist movement, for all of the flaws, some of which were articulated by Ted, the environmentalist movement was an extraordinarily successful movement because it was a movement. It was not just the set of 12 or 13 laws passed between 1967 and 1973, including the Clean Air and Water Act and NEPA, that transformed our government's relationship with the natural world. And it wasn't just the Ralph Nader's Raiders revolution of an explosion of nonprofit legal groups that gave us, among other things, I think, the procedural fetishism that we live with today. It was also a movement of recycling bins and whole earth catalog and reduce, reuse, recycle, and Earth Day, which, by the way, was the single most popular movement, the single biggest protest in American history in terms of the number of people who participated in it. The reason we live in a world that is strewn with environmental thinking from the highest levels of government to the subtlest thoughts that people have about where plastic should go at the end of a Thursday is because it succeeded as a movement. It succeeded at the level of changing the defaults that people have about thinking of the relationship between our bodies and our activity and the physical environment. It was massively successful in many different ways along those levels. And also, by the way, I mean, the Clean Air and Water Act were massively successful in terms of cleaning up the air and the water, despite the fact that some of those laws have left a legacy that we're trying to unwind. I would love for this movement to be equally successful, which is to say, I would love for it to succeed at all the levels that I just said environmentalism succeeded at. I want it to change law in Washington. I want it to change legal norms. I want it to change the way that people think as voters and as contributors to the nonprofits in their community. When they think about how do I solve this problem, to have that instinct to say, can we solve this problem by expanding the supply of the thing that is most necessary? But here's where I actually want to turn the table and ask you a question, because I do think that you come at this from a slightly different view. I think that while I have debatably popularized ideas that live in this solar system that we can call abundance, you have some very smart anxieties about the costs of popularizing any idea in a sharply polarized political environment.
Yeah.
So I would love you to tell me, is it bad? Is this bad? I mean, is the fact that Kamala Harris is talking about housing supply on, Call Her Daddy, is that bad in some ways that we might not be able to anticipate in the moment, because right now we're just excited that we're having more people use the word housing and supply in a sentence, especially in a podcast listened to by 20 million people.
Yeah, I mean, it's too soon to tell in some level, but I do worry. I feel like on the kind of housing abundance agenda, that movement, YIMBYism, as we used to call it, has had a lot of success in different states over the past 5 years. I mean, it's quite recent, but has built a lot of power, I would say, largely by, persuading experts in the field who have different affiliations, persuading a certain number of key stakeholders in state legislatures, and then by building bipartisan coalitions which pass laws, the kinds of laws that, if you just go to a random city council person, they'll say, oh no, people are getting really mad if there's construction in the neighborhood. But if you get a bipartisan bill in a state legislature with validators from both sides and a lot of experts being like, yeah, this is good, you can get this stuff done. And there hasn't been huge political backlash to housing laws that have passed in Florida, in Montana, in California. They keep passing legislation iteratively in a bipartisan way. I think it's gone very well. As housing costs became a more national issue, we started to see pressure for national politicians to address it. And we've seen Vice President Harris, both in a really encouraging way, talking about creating 3 million new units, but also talking about national rent control, right? And it's like, the more you elevate these questions to, this is a top tier political issue, there's a possibility in that, but there's also the risk of tilting in really kind of destructive ways. And I think that we've already seen, a tendency, I think a politically understandable tendency to bracket immigration questions and say well, we don't need that on our abundance agenda, right? Because that's such a political hot button.
Anyway, we were literally talking about the downsides of popularizing a movement, because getting attention, I mean, honestly, the theatrical timing was quite remarkable.
I actually at first thought it was a bit that somebody had set up. So, I mean, this is sort of to my point, right? To an extent, we are talking about technical questions in this domain, right? Like how do you make more COVID rapid tests, right? Is not a question that I would expect a typical citizen in an advanced democracy to actually have insight into, right? You want regulatory agencies to be run by people with technical expertise. You want things to be done sort of correctly. I mean, I can say I'm pro-nuclear, but that doesn't amount to anything, right? We are going to have to regulate that sector. And we're saying, well, the regulations that exist, they're not correct. They don't meet cost-benefit analysis. And to some extent, it seems to me that it's easier to make a change like that in the back rooms rather than to have people being like, allow more radiation. Because like, is that even plausible? I feel like when things get into a mass movement space, you tend to have a kind of an irrationalism, a movement toward extremes, a lack of weighing of costs and benefits. And you know, you get what we see here this
So
afternoon.
yeah, I'd love to respond in housing, just because I think responding in the realm of energy might be a little bit too proximally emotional at the moment. So on the realm of housing, you know, both of us are basketball fans, and we're familiar with the advanced statistic of VORP, value over replacement
Yes.
player. And I think it's important to think about what is the replacement value of higher salience to housing? Because you're dealing with trade-offs here. If housing doesn't have attention paid to it, then the cause of YIMBYism isn't advertised, and therefore it can't be popularized in a way that's being shared between legislative bodies. In the last 5 years, it's not just the state of California that's passed all of these housing bills that have cleared away some regulations and made it easier to build, accessory dwelling units and larger apartment buildings. It's also Montana. It's also Vermont. These ideas are being shared, right, in a kind of network of letters between between legislatures, right? There's been this elite movement that's been very successful at popularizing these issues. So I would say that YIMBYism has absolutely been better than the replacement of YIMBYism not having salience among elite networks. The next question, though, I think, and this is what you were talking about, is what are the benefits of popularizing this at a more national level, of talking about it on popular podcasts, and Kamala Harris talking about it and maybe speeches she's giving at the DNC and hopefully at an inaugural address. I would say that while the risks are there, that you put up a big bat sign that attracts people to national housing policy debates, and you're going to get some ideas there that are bad, you're also going to get policy making that you wouldn't otherwise get, right? So my optimistic bet, and I'd love this to be stress tested, is that trade-offs exist, but the net balance, the net VORP of more attention being paid to housing at the national level is going to lead to policies that expand housing development rather than restrict it.
I mean, it might. I think we don't know, but it's a concern that I have, and it's something. Well, this is my question for you, because I think you and Ezra both have in common. You're like really nice guys, very like friendly, personable. I think you write articles that people like, and they praise them. And it's not a coincidence that like they were in here. They were yelling at me. Because I'm a jerk. And, abundance in some ways is like such a great conceptual framework for friendly people, because it's all about how we can have a friendlier world, and there's enough for everyone, and like, why fight? But I also do think that you're looking at a lot of sort of, concrete pain points, right? And especially if you want to go with a mass movement, a popularizing framework. I mean, don't you need to get into some kind of nasty fights with other people who are out there, versus in a lower key way, you can just like persuade the sensible people, like let's do the sensible thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure that I have the perfect answer to it right now. I can say that the project, the book, was born out of frustration and even anger, but that we wanted the book to be methodical, fair, and true. We didn't want the book to be a polemic. The world has enough polemics as it is, and it won't suffer from any shortage of polemics if this movement continues to grow. What we wanted to do was more to explain how the world got to be the way it is, and that means taking seriously the viewpoints of your political nemesis. But I do think that we're pretty clear about who those adversaries are. This is not, strictly speaking, a project that is for MAGA Republicans. We're not going to convince those people, largely speaking, that this is a movement that they should take up. If they take it up, that's fantastic. This is a book for progressives. And so the adversaries that we're pointing out tend to be progressives. The frustration is born out of the idea that progressives claim that they support housing abundance, And yet you have in California, in Oregon, in New York, in Washington, D.C., obvious laws that constrict the construction of sufficient housing. And people say that we want abundant clean energy, but then there's all these barriers that we know about. And we say that we stand on the side of science and invention, but it's just absolutely extraordinary when you dig into the numbers, how many barriers we put up to the practice of science in America. There are surveys of scientists that suggest that the average American scientist spends about 40% of their time doing paperwork. 40% of their time filling out paperwork. Think about this. If the American academic community suddenly came down with a virus that left them with chronic fatigue disorder such that they had to sleep for half of the year, we'd say this was an absolute catastrophe that required America's attention. But this is the status quo that we created for ourselves. The chronic fatigue disorder that they have is legislation that mandates a certain amount of paperwork that they have to do. That comes from a bias, a legislative bias, to solve problems of trust by adding more paperwork. And that is a state capacity problem that we can solve, and the only way to solve it is to take on the fellow progressives who believe that those paperwork requirements are valid. So I'm not embarrassed or shy about having those contentious conversations, but I think it's really important to have those conversations with all the facts on the table, and that requires understanding history. And so first and foremost, the project is a historical project. How did we get here? And the beginning and the end, the brackets of the book are more about taking the philosophical argument of pointing out the ways in which progressives have got it wrong over the last 50 years.
I mean, the paperwork one, is fascinating though, because that really does strike me as a quintessential example of something that it's very important because, as you say, right, if you're hobbling science, the implications of that to the long term are awful. But also, I just can't possibly imagine getting large groups of people to care about federal grant regulations, right? That's some kind of an insider process that you're talking about there. And you're trying to say to other insiders, hey, this is not on the electorate's radar screen, but it's actually quite important.
Absolutely. And I definitely don't want to suggest, when I say that I want abundance to be a movement, I don't mean that I want every item in this book to become popular at the level of Call Her Daddy. I don't expect us to be having conversations about the Paperwork Reduction Act on these kind of podcasts. I do, however, want the underlying ideas to be folded more into the defaults of the typical Democratic voter. I want the typical Democratic voter to approach ideas with the thoughts that are embedded in this book. Now, there are policies in this book that are incredibly technocratic. You're absolutely right. And those ideas are at the moment not for the general reading audience at all. They're for anyone interested in understanding why do we have the problems in science that we have today? Because of laws passed in the 1960s and 1970s that have burdened scientists with all of these regulations. That is a story for people interested in science and science policy. But at a larger level, I do want this room, which currently has 310 people in it, and 2 years ago might have had 50, I want this conference in 5 years to have 1,000 people in the room. And then 5 years after that, I would love it if we had to rent out huge facilities in Orlando, God willing, that have 5,000 people in the room, right? I want the people interested in these topics. I want the population of those groups to grow with the understanding, of course, that you're never going to have a mass movement about the paperwork reduction.
But so next year at the Abundance Day March, we're all going to be there with our signs and cool stuff like that. That's.
Yeah, I mean, an Abundance Day March, I can't exactly imagine what the parameters of that would be. But if what you're saying is that you have voters, not just politicians, but the people who join their housing groups and participate in PTAs and join capital T, capital G, the groups across the country, if I can infect them with a bias toward wanting to solve problems on the supply side, that will yield benefits that can't just be captured in the number of rules that we change at the federal level. Because, as you know, and as you've written about, so many of these problems aren't necessarily levers that exist at the federal level. They're levers that exist at the state and local level. And I don't know how you have a philosophical revolution that affects the national, state, and local level if you don't have something that at least resembles a movement.
So can I ask, did you see Megalopolis?
I have not seen it yet. I have, however, seen the scene that everyone has seen about go back to the club and that little thing.
No, I thought it was striking because I did see it, but nobody did. And this is a movie. Somebody tried to make a like pop culture artifact that I think was on the themes of abundance, and everybody hated it. And maybe that's because Francis Ford Coppola is bad at making movies, but
Of all the bad reviews I read of Abundance, none of them said that it was bad because of the ideologies being represented in the movie.
I know.
If anything, that was the best part of it.
But it's, I think to me, it represented the idea that there's actually something challenging about trying to represent these ideas in a mass cultural framework, because I think a reason that like a housing developer becomes a stock villain or like an evil polluting corporation, right, is that we like stories with a hero and with a villain and a kind of a concentrated villain. And the idea of a villain that's just a kind of like sociocultural malaise or like bias or status quo, it's like it's hard to represent artistic. I mean, you wrote a great book, about hits and like what makes pop culture popular. And it strikes me on that level as like a very kind of challenging problem, even as at an adequate level of abstraction. Of course, everyone can be like, it would be great if like we all had more stuff, right? But when you think about the problems, like I think people have this very strong instinct that like the source of a problem needs to be like a small villainous actor. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I wonder, like, can you really convince people on a big level that, not that like abundance is good, but that a lot of problems don't stem from that kind of a villain?
These are all fantastic questions. And I don't know that at the moment I can give you a plot line, like a plot arc, like akin to The Lion King, like a perfectly archetypal plot arc that represents within it the themes of abundance. Although, I mean, to a certain extent, like, no, I'm not going to go there. I was going to say that Avatar is like kind of abundancy, but it's also kind of environmentally, and I don't want the wrath of Ted. So let me put it this way. I do think that America every 40 to 50 years seems to pass through eras that we can think of as coherent political orders. And these political orders are defined by the subtle ways in which both Democrats and Republicans seem to have a kind of conspiracy of agreement that exists underneath the political fights that they're having. So between the 1930s and 1960s, the relevant political order was New Deal liberalism, or let's just call it New Deal-ism. Mm-hmm. And when I say it's a political order, what I mean is that obviously FDR and Truman were adherents of New Deal liberalism as we conceive of it today. But I want you to go back and read the speeches of Dwight Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. Read what he said about welfare. Read what he said about the importance of building things that connect America, for example, through an interstate highway system. If you take a Dwight Eisenhower speech about the benefits of welfare and building for the common American, and you took Eisenhower's name out of it, you would think this speech would sound fantastic coming out of the mouths of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So there was a way in which this era was defined by a shared understanding that you could build for the common man, transform the physical environment, while at the same time, generation after generation, adding to the amount of welfare that we were giving to low-income Americans. And then, in the 1970s, something changed. And you had a president who came into power who talked about the idea that government was not the solution to America's problems. And he deregulated the trucks, and he deregulated the trains. And everyone who's not in this room might think that I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, but you are smart enough to know that I'm talking about Big JC.
There you go.
This is Jimmy Carter. If you look at Jimmy Carter's inaugural addresses and State of the Union addresses in the late 1970s, they sound so much like Ronald Reagan, it's absolutely remarkable. He talked over and over again about how we cannot trust the government to solve our problems, and we have to find ways to unlock America's entrepreneurial spirit by deregulating industries that have too much invested interest, like the trucks and the trains and communication. I guess telecommunications was under Reagan, but the airplanes is another good example of JC dereg. So here's another example. of how you can absolutely say that the late 1970s into the 1980s, into the Clintonian 1990s, where he was changing welfare as we know it, people talked about the relationship between government and the world in a way that was Reaganite, in a way that was even neoliberal. Of course, under the surface, there were lots of changes happening to our relationship with the physical environment that massively regulated it and made it much harder for us to build and change our physical world. And so the growth machine of the New Deal era became an anti-growth machine of the last 50 years. What I'm saying is, when I'm calling for a movement, what I'm calling for to a certain extent isn't Avatar 5: abundance. I'm calling for a kind of political order in which there is a new conspiracy of agreement that exists among politicians in the left and center and right, where they say, there's a certain way that we can approach the problems of our era. That approach involves a bias toward building. It involves trying to understand how markets work, so that rather than just throw money at a problem, we identify the bottlenecks that exist within these key industries, like housing and energy, and we resolve those bottlenecks by understanding the market. There are all sorts of ways in which I think we can synthesize the best of the New Deal era, which was pro-building, and the best of the neoliberal era, which at its best was wisely pro-market, while also allowing the welfare state to grow, and create a new kind of political order, which is an order of abundance. And so maybe that's a way to strike a balance between my strong case that abundance should be a movement and your fears that abundance is unmovementable. And I take those fears. I think they're really smart. Maybe the more cautious way to put it is to say that what America's crying out for right now is a new political order. New Dealism, neoliberalism, we need something new that synthesizes the best of our history, and I think we can do it.
All right, fantastic. We've gone over time. There was a small interruption, but I think that's adequately inspiring, and we should maybe leave it at that. Give a round of applause. Yeah.